was a challenging time. And, you know, that was interesting when I was 12, but it wasn't really clear what to do with that in terms of how I was a student or how I was a professional. But, you know, the passion always burned for me, and it was a pretty integral part of my life. You know, it certainly helped me get through MIT and other studies and so on. So when I was signing up for my PhD, I was going to do it, I thought, in a very interesting topic as well around corporate sustainability, which had been what I'd been working on at Sloan, including a case study of Nike's corporate sustainability programs. There's just something inside of me that just was so passionate about it. I couldn't leave it, even though it was a good topic. My advisor, I remember the first day of my program in the PhD was open to it. And so I just decided to make the switch. And it's interesting because, well, mindfulness has been really intrinsically connected to well-being, since, as Juan noted, it was first used in medical practice here in the 70s. Actually, the use there was pioneered by a guy named John Kabat-Zinn, who was actually an MIT grad, PhD grad, I believe, biochemistry or something. I forget exactly what. But anyways, he was in med school at UMass and on the faculty there, and decided to start using mindfulness techniques for people who really were suffering, like with terminal cancer and other kinds of very gnarly medical conditions, as a way to help them deal with the experience and the suffering associated with these very unpleasant states. So, there'd been a lot of work around well-being, but, as luck should have it, it was just sort of a confluence of, I was joining a program in organizational behavior, which is, essentially the psychology of how people act and function and think and emote in organizations. And so there just seemed to be a natural confluence. So I started to work on it. And at that time, it was 2009, 2010. And it's been gratifying to see, I feel like there was sort of an uptick right around then in terms of other people being interested in mindfulness as a technique to help people work more effectively, not just cope with cancer or other such problems. So, it's kind of my interest and the external world sort of dovetailed and merged. And so that brings us to today, whereas Juan said, it is actually $1 billion plus industry in terms of providing, like workplace mindfulness training and so on. So it's gone from being almost this weird archaic idea, buried in Buddhist literature, to being actually a pretty mainstream practice and focus of research, in many different contexts and sectors today. So it's exciting to actually be able to talk to you all about it and share, I think, what I think is actually a really, really interesting, not just psychological aspect, but a body of practice and that goes along with it. That's really impactful in many domains of life. Well, I study it in the context of work. It's really much broader than that. So let me go walk you through it. We're going to go talk a little bit about what mindfulness is, what the impacts are for the workplace, some of the science around it. And there really is a huge body of multidisciplinary evidence at this point. And then we'll talk a little bit about the integration at work, which is sort of one of the areas that I was sort of most interested in, and I think is least well explored. All right, so here's a little bit of a graph. You can see sort of interest in mindfulness in the terms of both scientific articles and news articles. Wow. And you can see, nothing. And then, early 2000s, it starts to take off and you just get this exponential growth. And to my knowledge, this has just continued since. It's probably even higher today. Once there was a body of practice established, pioneered in the medical field by John Kabat-Zinn and others, like terms like mindfulness-based stress reduction, that was their original intervention. People started to see the actual clinical applications. There started to be increasingly rigorous scientific evidence supporting this being beneficial. It wasn't just, hippy dippy kind of stuff. Then you started to get more serious studies, more rigor. The psychologists started playing. You started to be able to do regular psychological research with mindfulness, not just, hardcore clinical trials with very sick people in the medical sector. And then that's when things really took off. Not surprisingly, with so much interest and increasing scientific rigor, we've seen this sort of really start to infuse mainstream practice in many, many places. MIT has offered some mindfulness training, I believe, through the health center, but so many other organizations do today. Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, Mayo Clinic, the Seattle Seahawks and LA Lakers, the Marines, Aetna, Google, you name it. and there's probably hundreds more. Even British Parliament had a program at least going for a little while. So this, it's gone from this very niche thing to something that's actually part of mainstream corporate organizational practice. There was a survey done by Fidelity and some consulting group showed that more than half of major corporations today are offering some form of mindfulness training. So it's really everywhere at this point. So as I said, so sort of three main topics to discuss. We'll see how far we get with each, but give a little introduction to the experience and practice of mindfulness, just to give you guys a little taste if you haven't had it already, and talk about it a little bit conceptually. Then we'll talk all about the impacts of mindfulness at work based on the multidisciplinary, rigorous evidence around the construct. And then we'll sort of discuss the last bit of just how do you actually bring mindfulness in work? What does that look like? What are the possibilities and challenges there? Which I think is, as I said, more cutting edge. Okay. So let's take a few seconds. You were thinking about your typical day at the office, or running around with your family at home. Like, how would you describe it to somebody in the elevator? Like, what are a few words that come to mind for you?
Very busy for me. So mind challenging at times and exhausting also.
Busy, challenging, exhausting. Yeah.
Chris, I'm retired, so I can't really give you a good description of my day other than it's much more relaxed than when I was working.
Fair enough. Well, how would you have described it when you were working?
Periods of work in front of the computer and then interruptions during the day. So it'd be interruptions, work, interruptions, lunchtime, and then back to the same old thing. The afternoons would be less active than the mornings. The mornings, when I was working from my company, the mornings were more hectic than the afternoons.
Yeah.
There were meetings also, which I would attend almost daily. So that was another facet of what I did, was either go to meetings, working at the computer, or make trips into the factory to visit people.
Mm-hmm. So, I think we can ask, I think your experiences are relatively typical, right? And, there's sort of this idea of mindfulness being kind of like this state on the left, right? A beautiful Zen garden and so on. But I think, if you talk to most people about their experience of work and life with kids and whatever else, it's kind of more like this person on the right, like this never ending treadmill. You get your thoughts running, you just got to keep going, and it's like you're working in front of the computer and you get that interruption, and then someone gives you another to do and then you got to respond to that. And it's all just this sense of chaos and kind of never ending activity. So, I think this is sort of our baseline state. Some people describe this almost like an autopilot, right? You kind of show up and then those routines just kind of kick in, your mental habits, right? So I've done some interviews and this person describes their experience as being like, I just automatically go into autopilot when I show up at work. It just happens. To take time to reflect, I can't do it. There's too much going on. From that time I get in, I'm going and it's one thing after another. And they said they'd go, 8 hours. This person that I spoke with said they'd go 8 hours, and it's like they'd show up at 9 and they'd leave at 5. And it's like they wouldn't remember a thing in between because they were just going so habitually, so quickly. And, when you're running like that, it's hard to watch yourself think. It's hard to watch why am I engaging this way? What's leading me to respond in certain ways? And oftentimes we tend to enact sort of old habits, even when they aren't necessarily what we should be doing in a given context. So this is actually, this propensity to sort of be out of the present and sort of enacting routines and scripts from the past, or looking at things in that way, or recalling prior events, is actually a very fundamental aspect of humanity. So it's so much so that neuroscientists actually call this sort of mind wandering as our, quote, default mode. And this showed up when they'd throw people in neural scanners, fMRI machines, and they'd sort of give them a task and then they'd let them rest a little bit and give them a task and let them rest. And their thought, when they first started doing this was, when people are doing a task, their brain would light up, and then, when they rested, sort of slow down. As it turns out, it was actually the opposite. When they're doing the task, it actually got quieter. And then when they were sitting there, the brain just revved up because it was thinking about all these things, what you did yesterday, what are you going to have for lunch later, what your boss said, this project. And so really large scale research from Harvard published in Science shows that we actually mind wander roughly 50% of the time. So just a huge fraction of our lives is actually kind of in this sort of state. We're sort of stuck in our heads. We aren't really tuned into the present, engaging with what's in front of us. So I think it's, we have this sense that we're kind of here, but actually when you really look at the evidence, there's a large part of our lives that is spent actually not really here in the moment. So if you're willing, so go with me for a minute. We'll do a little bit of a brief mindfulness exercise just to give you a taste. And it might be a little bit different than what you're used to. But the classic way to do this is just to sort of sit fully in a chair or wherever you're sitting. Really just come into your body, let your eyes drift closed, and really start to tune in to being here. Like letting go of that chatter that we always have. Sort of tune in and feel the breath actually coming into your body. It's so simple. You can just watch that breath come in through your mouth and flow out. Let it come in again. Let it flow out. You can start to pay attention to the different aspects where it's coming in. Like, what's the sensation in your lips as that flows in? What's the feeling? You can tune a bit deeper. What's the feeling as the air sort of rushes in and out of your lungs? That point right where it hits in the middle. What can you feel in your chest and your diaphragm as those muscles expand and contract as you take a breath? You can pay attention even to the back of your back against the chair, the pressure, whatever else you're feeling there. And you can let that awareness just sort of spread across your body, even to other parts of the room if you're hearing a noise. There's a sound. For me, I hear crickets. And then simply you can just return and let your eyes open, return back to the room normally. It's really that simple. That's the essence of mindfulness practice. So what did you experience? Did you notice anything different than usual?
Well, for me, I was able to tune out from various distractions and other thoughts entering my head, and I was focused mainly on my breathing and what you were saying. But full disclosure, I have done this before. I've known how to do mindfulness practice for about 5 years, Chris.
Oh, great.
So I kind of got into it pretty quickly.
Okay, good. Anybody else have a similar or different experience?
I felt my mind emptying. I felt like I had an empty mind. But then in the background, I was thinking, should I breathe in through my nose and breathe out through my mouth? Or should I breathe in through my mouth and breathe out through my mouth? So that was going along in parallel.
It's funny, right? Because, we kick into that so easily. We start evaluating, am I doing this right? I have to do it differently. I did it wrong. It should be mouth, should it be nose, right? And that's such a natural state for us to be in. And I think we spend a large fraction of our lives, and particularly our work lives, in that state, right? Am I writing this memo correctly? Am I speaking to my boss the right way? So even when you have a very simple task of simply attending to your breath, it comes up even then, right?
Right.
So, but yeah, hopefully you could get at least a little taste of quieting, and then you have a little bit of space when that voice comes up, am I doing it right? I should do it this way. I should do it that way. You can kind of see it as being a little bit different, right? It's kind of almost outside you. There's a little bit of space. Anything else that stood out for you guys? Okay, so that's really the essence of mindfulness practice. It really is just anchoring our attention in the present moment. And then our mind kicks up, it activates, some kind of thought stream comes in. As I said, that default mode is very, very strong. It's very, very natural to go there. But hopefully by anchoring ourselves in the present, we have a little bit more space, a little bit more awareness of that process playing out. And then over time, if you spend more time doing this kind of mindfulness practice, at least in my experience, your mind tends to get more quiet, just naturally, not that you're trying to suppress thoughts, but that kind of checking in about, oh, am I doing it right? Should it be my nose? Should it be my mouth? Or whatever else, you would turn your attention to mentally. It just sort of dissipates a little bit or dissolves. And then you're kind of just really here. So if we talk about mindfulness, it's that experience of sort of paying attention to present moment experience and doing it with openness and curiosity. You're not sort of forcing yourself to do it, but it's just kind of a gentleness, a gentle attending. And so we can talk about mindfulness practice that we just did, a very little version of. So this is an exercise that actually strengthens our ability to be mindfully present throughout the day. So you can imagine, you do this once and you get a little sense of it, but, imagine you did it once every hour, even for 30 seconds or a minute, a very little bit. Over time, you do that for a week, like that's actually a lot of time, right? There's a lot of check-ins. And so that sort of, at least in my experience, you might start to notice that sort of feeling of being a little calmer, a little more here carries over. Maybe you're in a meeting and it's getting contentious or busy, but you don't necessarily get pulled away to the same extent. At least that's what a lot of people report. Now let's clarify, mindfulness is not a few things, right? It's not tuning out. You're not sort of checking out from the world and distancing from the world. And it's not necessarily being giddy or high. You're not just sort of necessarily just sort of going, ha, 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 right? It is actually a tuning in, a sensitivity to what's here. While your thoughts make quiet, it's not an intentional stopping of your thoughts, because even that is actually an activity. It's not necessarily getting into planning for the future or remembering your past. So these are some things that it's not. When we talk about its essence, it really does involve that sense of self-awareness, maintaining some sense of intentionality, being able to maintain a sense of equanimity and balance under stress. And when you're doing all those things, when you're attending, as I'll get to a bit more later, it's really helping us connect with others, right? Because we're really there with them instead of having that chatter going in our minds. So to me, I kind of like having pictures that capture the experience. And this is kind of what it feels like to me. Maybe you can relate, right? But normally our mode is just kind of all these gears going and spinning and revving and all that. And mindfulness is just kind of like hitting that pause button that gives a little bit of space from that, a little bit more quiet. But obviously you may have a different experience. So that's a little bit about what mindfulness is, how we get into this state. But then let's talk about, like, why is that important? Why does that affect how we work? So spent a lot of time in my doctoral program working with a whole bunch of colleagues. I think we had 8 or 9 co-authors on this paper. And basically we went out and said, hey, what can we say about mindfulness at work? And we started reviewing literally the entire field at the time, which I think was about 4,000 scientific papers. Not all of them were relevant, but we really said, hey, there's a ton of evidence on this. What can we say about how mindfulness impacts how people work? So this is a framework that we came away with, and I'll sort of go into some details and talk about sort of each little box as we go. But basically, the big idea here is that mindfulness impacts your attention. We sort of did this little exercise that involved attending to your breath. It's very simple thing. But that simple practice actually can change how we attend to our lives, our world, ourselves. And that's a change that happens moment by moment. So when you have these fundamental changes in how the mind works, that can affect all kinds of other important aspects of how we function on a minute-by-minute basis. Changes how we think, how we feel, how we behave. Amazingly enough, it actually has some pretty dramatic impacts even for how our bodies work. And so then you can imagine, all this stuff is really fundamental, foundational kinds of things about how we engage. So if you could see some improvements in these areas, well, it's not surprising you'd see some implications for work. And so we found is we can categorize these impacts and outcomes into three broad categories: well-being, performance, and relationships. So I'll walk you through a little bit, talk through some of the things we see. But as you can see, it's pretty broad, it's pretty profound, and it's hard to slot into any one area because it's so the scope is quite huge, really. Okay, so first thing we mentioned, right? Mindfulness can help you be a little more attentive, have a little more awareness. So there's lots and lots of ways this shows up, but one obvious one is more mindful people tend to space out less. And it's, as I mentioned, right, we spend about 50% of our lives typically mind wandering about something or else. Sometimes that's innocuous, right? If you're sitting around the house watching TV, big deal. But at other times that's a big problem, right? If you're in a meeting and you don't pay attention to what someone's saying, or you're driving your car, you don't see somebody else. So what we find with mindful people is they tend to space out quite a bit less, and so they're really more grounded in what's happening in the present moment. There's other interesting things that happen with attention of mindful people as well. They're better at controlling their attention, right? With interruptions, like Lester, you mentioned that. So mindful people are better at directing their attention where they want it to go rather than just getting pulled one way or another. Another really interesting thing that we're seeing is that mindful people may actually be able to attend to more stuff. They're more efficient at attending to things. So basically you might actually be able to expand your attentional capacity, which is actually a pretty dramatic change in how the mind works. You just see more things, process more information. It's really important.
Chris, I have a question on
Please go ahead.
Can you, that slide.
Mhm.
First of all, I want to know what the vertical axis represents, and the second question is, how are space outs being measured by either you or the people who put this together?
Yeah, this was coming from some folks, Mrazek et al., and their group out of, or at least they were out of Santa Barbara. I think he's moved on someplace. So they basically had people in 3 different training programs, or 3 different conditions: of relaxation condition and a reading condition. I think they were looking at The Hobbit or something, and then a meditation condition. So there's a test called the SART, Sustained Attention to Response Task. And so it actually measures, like, they give a bunch of prompts, right? There might be like 50 prompts or something as you sit at your computer. And so they're measuring the people who are not in the meditation condition tended to miss the prompts more often than others. So I think that's a raw count.
Oh,
there. Yeah. So, I mean, again, of course, this is a very contrived laboratory task.
sure.
But the implication is, of course, it applies to real world phenomena as well. Does that answer your question?
Okay, yeah, that you're saying that the scale on the left, well, you answered the second question, how is it being measured?
Yeah.
The first question is still kind of unanswered in that, what does a 3 mean here? 3 out of the total number of prompts, 3 prompts missed out of the total number
Yeah, exactly.
given?
I forget
that
the
what you
exact
meant?
numbers that they had, but it still have someone sit and maybe they give them 48 prompts in a in a protocol, like, I don't know, over whatever 5 minutes or something like that. And then if the people who are in the relaxation and the reading conditions would miss 4+ prompts on
I see.
average, and the people in the meditation condition would miss 2 prompts.
2 prompts,
So
okay.
yeah, like roughly half is likely to miss a prompt. Yeah, I realized I probably could make that a little clear. Thanks for flagging it. So another thing that tends to happen when people are more mindful is they tend to think better in certain ways. It seems when I was first getting started with the research, of course, I was thinking about mindfulness is helping you reduce stress and so on. And believe me, there's plenty of research that shows that. But some of the cognitive effects, I think, are actually pretty dramatic and interesting, and certainly very important for work. So here's an interesting one. Has anyone ever seen one of these 9-dot problems before? Probably have, right?
Long time ago.
Yeah. So, not everyone has. The prompts, the puzzle you have to solve is, can you connect all of these dots with, what is it, 4 lines,
4 lines.
9 dots and 4 dots. So if you just remain stuck in thinking about the box here is the box for your lines, it's impossible, right? You can cover 8 of the 9 easily, but getting the 9th is impossible. So these are called insight problems. You have to have the insight that the box is actually not a real box. And so what you have to do is sort of expand your thinking and go outside the box with the lines. Once you do that, it's actually a very easy problem to solve. But if you don't have that insight, then you actually can't solve that problem. So what they find, interestingly enough, is that people who are in a meditation condition were actually much better at solving these problems. Again, it's about 50% better. On average, they were solving roughly 1.2 as opposed to 0.7 for people who are in the control condition around mind wandering. So again, the implication here is that if you're able to step back and get a little distance, kind of like Keith, you were doing with your voice, right? It gets easier to sort of question your assumptions and look at things from a different perspective. I think about, say, an MIT group, right? You guys are probably, some of you are probably engineers working on challenging R&D problems or something. Coming up with those sort of creative insights and solutions to gnarly problems. To me, this is a very core cognitive activity for that. You have to look at things in a new way. Another really interesting thing that comes out is that mindfulness can actually help your information processing capacity, specifically short-term memory or what's technically called working memory. So this is basically the amount of information you can hold in your head at one time. So you can imagine this is important for all kinds of work, self-control, regulation, imagine you can have 20 pieces of information in your head at a time versus 10. It makes it easier to write something or code software or whatever. So they actually tried out these techniques with a bunch of Marines that were in training to go deploy over to, I think it was Iraq, but could have been Afghanistan. But in any case, what they found is that a lot of the Marines who didn't really do these meditation practices, their ability to hold a lot of information in their head really deteriorated over the course of training to a significant extent, nearly 20%. They found the individuals who were meditating, it actually increased by about 10% over that same period. So it's actually a pretty dramatic change. Oh, and they had some other control groups too, where there was a noted difference here. So the implication here is that mindfulness can help you stay calm, even in this very stressful, demanding situation that normally taxes cognitive resources and leaves you sort of relatively incapable. And instead, for these folks, it was actually helping them expand this capability, even in a very difficult, trying period. And they found actually that this capability to increase working memory and reduce space outs correlated with improved GRE performance on a particular, in another study published at another good journal, Psychological Science. They found that just doing a 2-week training program actually helped students get I think it was a 16 percentile increase in their scores on average. So, it's a pretty marked increase in your GRE scores just for doing little meditations, right? I forget exactly the total number of hours of training, but it was maybe like 8 to 10 hours. It's a pretty modest intervention to get a pretty big difference in your GRE score. So that's thinking better. But feeling better is another major area that's helpful. Mindfulness does all kinds of things around emotional processing. We could spend the whole talk just on that alone. But I think one of the more interesting things is that it sort of acts a bit like a buffer, right? Like stuff happens outside you, and normally we get triggered in some way. Maybe you feel a sense of threat or you feel a sense of opportunity or whatever. When you're more mindful, things tend to happen. You just sort of experience them as happening. You don't necessarily judge them as good or bad, which helps people experience a greater sense of distance and calm while they're facing various events. So interestingly enough, do we have any neuroscientists in the room or anyone who sort of has a cognitive background? No. Okay. Well, anyways, there's certain parts of the brain that are essentially responsible for generating our sense of self. There's a whole network of these nodes, and I certainly can tell you each of them. But one of them is called the PCC, the posterior cingulate cortex, I believe. And so that's been found in generating the sense of self, right? And a sense of self over time. So they found that people who meditate actually really suppress activation in this brain region. The implication is that you're literally quieting your sense of self in your brain. And again, this is a finding that's actually been shown in many studies. It seems pretty robust to me, not that I'm a neuroscientist. So what's the implication of that? Why do we care about this, as kind of interesting as it is? Well, it's actually been linked to all kinds of interesting stuff. So this was a study that I have no idea how they got through the IRB, but these guys in Wisconsin basically said, let's go burn people while they meditate. And don't ask me how they do it. They figured it out. So they're sitting there burning people with this like hot poker kind of thing. It said, how do you feel? And so these are the results from that. So you can see both the novice meditators and expert meditators are the blue and the red respectively. So both groups said, hey, there's about a 7 intensity of pain. I forget exactly how hot it was, but relatively hot. But the interesting thing here is the expert meditators actually found it to be a much less unpleasant sensation. Both groups rated it as unpleasant, but the experts gave it about a 3.5. So not that big a deal. Whereas the novices were giving this, a 6. So it's like, pretty uncomfortable for them. So there's actually that's distancing that you saw before in the self actually correlates with this pain signal, right? It's kind of you're literally distancing yourself from this experience of getting burned, which is kind of wild to me. But imagine if you just had things that went badly and you normally feel a sense of pain or discomfort around it, and then suddenly you don't. Like, that's pretty powerful. So we'll come back to that one later. Another thing that I think we talked a little bit before about was self-control. If you're sort of calmer, your mind isn't carrying you, it's not as automatic as it normally is, you can be more intentional. And so there's many ways this plays out with mindfulness. There's tons of research on this. But I think one of the most dramatic forms of research is actually showing that mindfulness helps people quit smoking, which is, I think most people think is, one of the most compulsive, addictive activities out there. So this was from a study where they had people in a mindfulness training program. And these weren't even people who were intending to quit. They just were smokers. And so when they put people in the mindfulness condition, they actually experienced a 60% drop in how much they smoke. 60% in 2 weeks.
Wow.
And they weren't telling them not to smoke. These weren't people who were trying not to smoke. They just stopped smoking, or not stopped, but greatly reduced their smoking. So the implication here is people aren't as driven by their cravings. They aren't as driven by their automatic mind. Maybe they're just either that's quieter or they're more aware of it. And they said, I don't really want to have it right now. So you can imagine if all those habits and impulses we normally have suddenly aren't ruling us to the same extent. You could act in a much more intentional, conscious way at work or wherever else you are. With me so far? Any questions? All right.
Well, I had a question on the previous slide with the experiment involving pain or burning. I'm sure you're aware that there have been documented cases of swamis and spiritual people in India who were able to walk barefooted over burning coals. And that to me would be because they were able to somehow not only reduce the pain level in their body, but maybe also due to their high level of mindfulness or meditative practice. So that to me would be a forerunner or a hint as to what would happen during this experiment, which you showed us, that there are people who meditate, out there and around halfway around the world who are able to reduce their sensitivity to burning pain in their body. So your reaction
Yeah, it's an
to
interesting
that.
idea. Maybe that inspired them. I don't actually know the backstory behind the research. That's an interesting thought. Thanks.
You're
I have a
welcome.
question.
Sure. Yeah, Juan.
So in over the different slides, you've kind of described the group differently. In one case, you said, well, more mindful people, or in another case, you said these people in a meditative state, or another case, it was these were people who were practicing. So I guess I'm wondering, are these benefits coming while you're practicing, or coming from practicing over like the time, or how do you define someone as being more mindful?
Yeah, great question. The things that go in the 2-hour presentation that don't make it in the 45-minute one. So originally, of course, people were more focused on studying meditation or meditation interventions, right? Either I could sit and do a meditation practice for a period of time, say 10 minutes, or I could participate in a training program. Maybe I go and meditate 20 minutes a day for 6 weeks, and then, let's see what happens. So those are still very common approaches to this. But people started to research and say, well, what if someone has just a general propensity to be more present, and other people tend to have a greater propensity to be more in their minds, right? More mind wandering. Can we capture that? Can we assess that? And as it turns out, at least to my reading of the literature, you can actually assess that to a reasonably effective extent. There's a particular survey called the Mindful Attention Awareness Scale, published in 2003. I think, to me, is one of the greatest pieces of scholarship I've read personally. And that measure has been correlated with all kinds of stuff since then. So the concept is not that you're necessarily capturing anyone's mindfulness in a given moment, but more just, for example, like, do people who tend to be more present deal with stressful circumstances better, right? And you could sort of study that over, say, a longitudinal study or something. So it's not perfect, but it seems to work pretty well, amazingly enough. Does that answer your question, Leo? Does that make sense?
Somewhat. So you do have a scale that can define or assess someone's mindfulness level, and generally you're saying these benefits align to people at the higher level of mindfulness. So the next question becomes, well, how do you get to the higher level of mindfulness? Is it innate, or is it something you do, right?
Well, according to them, at least, everyone has some level. Like, presumably we all have some level to attend to the present, and we all have some degree of attending to the past and future just by virtue of being human. So it's not a question of mindful, not mindful. It's not a dichotomous thing so much as more and less, right? And more and less frequently. So, you could also, sometimes people give it in kind of more of a state-like measure. It's like, how are you feeling right now? I feel pretty present. I feel pretty distracted, right? So you can modify it in different ways. But I'd say the most typical way, as you're sort of talking to people and say, how mindful are you, is to just to give them that survey. So I guess the one other way you can do it is you can literally ask people, how long have you practiced over your life, like the novices versus experts. So some of these people are, like Tibetan monks who have 30,000 hours of meditation experience, right? So that's another way to do it. I think that's what they use with this particular study. So that's another way to do it, but obviously trickier to do in general. So, all right, thanks, good question. So let's move on. So that's sort of the basics, right, about how mindful people function moment by moment, day by day. So, like, what are the implications of that for work? So that was the next phase of our review. Sorry, I meant to mention one last thing. So a lot of these things actually come from basically upgrading your brain. We talk about hardware and software, and with computers, right? There's a substrate for processing of chips and circuits and so on. And then, of course, there's software, there's code that leads those circuits to operate in ways that we designate. Same thing actually happens with mindfulness. There's a lot of evidence showing that mindfulness practice, meditating consistently, actually restructures your brain, does all kinds of stuff. Like, it thins out some of these areas that are correlate with emotional reactivity, like the amygdala. It tends to bolster, strengthen areas like the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, which is implicated in self-regulation and so on and so forth. So you actually literally build tissue in the areas you want to build it, and sometimes withdraw it from areas you wouldn't necessarily want to have a lot of tissue in. And likewise, it actually changes how those different parts work together. So for example, like, it can suppress how that default mode network operates, right? It becomes less influential. So you can imagine, if you're changing how your brain works, that's literally a second by second kind of thing you take with you anywhere you go. So it can be really powerful, I think, as a result. Sorry, let me get back to the slides. All right, so just to refresh you, right? Mindfulness impacts our ability to focus in various ways. That impacts how we think, feel, act, and how our bodies work. All right, so let's get to the punchline. What does it actually do to how do we work? Well, as you're probably aware, there's an enormous number of benefits for well-being with mindfulness, and we could spend all day talking about it. It's been correlated with increased immune response, reduced inflammation, reduced stress hormones like cortisol,
right?
lower burnout and stress, of course, lower disease, manifestations and symptomology and so on, less pain, or lower experiences of pain, and on and on. It's really an incredible body of literature. There's so much there, and it's basically all beneficial as far as I can tell. I've seen basically no evidence. As one example that's increasingly important to the workplace, even increased sleep and higher quality sleep. You wouldn't necessarily think of sleep as a very workplace focused thing. And I mean, at one level it's not, but we're just seeing more and more research these days that when people don't sleep, they're really non-functional at work. Like if you get 5 or 6 hours a night for basically less than a week, it's almost like you're going to work 2 or 3 drinks in. So you can imagine if you could improve people's sleep even a little bit, it could really improve their well-being and frankly their effectiveness at work. But here's a piece that I actually find the most amazing about all this literature, and it's gotten almost no press, which I find fascinating. There's actually an small but increasingly rigorous body of literature showing that mindfulness tends to slow aging processes, which I find kind of amazing. It's amazing they can even show it, much less that it happens. So here's 2 examples of studies that look at this. On the left, you see there's a series of, I believe, about 100 people. Some of them were just controls and some of them were meditators. They threw them in a neural scanner. And you can see the red areas are where their brain tissue correlates with age-related decline. And in the controls, it's pretty widely distributed across the brain, right? As you age, your brain neurons sort of fall apart and so on, the connections break over time. And these kinds of changes are related to things like Alzheimer's and decrements in intelligence and flexibility and so on. Well, certainly the meditators were not immune to this effect of aging. You can see it's much less affected. So the idea here, remember I mentioned that meditating can actually build tissue in your brain. It's kind of like exercising, right? Like as we get older, our bodies sort of deteriorate and get weaker. Same thing with your brain. As you meditate, you actually keep building up new tissue, and it sort of staves off this age-related decay in the physiology as well as the functionality. Same thing is happening at the genetic and biochemical level. Apparently there's a caps on our DNA called telomeres, and those are really good for us. They protect us from all kinds of problems. And basically those get shorter over the course of our lives. And that's where you can kind of run into issues. Essentially your DNA gets compromised over time as a result. So basically, and people won the Nobel Prize sort of researching this on telomeres. But as it turns out, being in a meditation retreat can actually increase the sort of protective capabilities of the body, telomerase specifically, against this genetic decay. So this stuff blows my mind, frankly. And, there's sort of anecdotal evidence that Tibetan monks tend not to get Alzheimer's and so on. To me, like individually, of course, it's great for all of us, right? It's great not to age. If you're managing a workforce, right? Like I'm at a school, we have a lot of faculty who are in their 60s, 70s, maybe even 80s. You can imagine you could keep people functional and, still performing effectively for a lot longer period of time.
I have a question.
That's, sorry, go ahead.
Looking at the left side of your slide, that raises the question as to how the information of these experiments is gathered. Does it require volunteers and who are willing to have their brain scanned in order
I believe that's the case
to do this?
Yeah, I think this study had about if I'm recalling correctly, I'd have to look at the details. They had about 100 people, 15 each cohort. And it's not an experiment. They're not manipulating the people. They're not telling them, you meditate more and you meditate less, but they're more just saying, okay, like how much have you meditated? How often? Let's compare your brain versus the people who didn't at all. If that makes sense.
So is this kind of research still going on, Christopher? Is there's still researchers still conducting experiments like this where they compare the results of control groups versus meditators, and then have them go into a machine to have their brain scanned for neural decay?
I
Is
believe
this
so. I think I actually just saw
continuing to
one.
go on?
Sorry, something to go on.
No, I'm just asking whether research like this is still going on, because this is kind of cutting edge research to me. Seems
Yeah.
like cutting edge research to me.
Yeah, I think so. I just saw a paper today, in fact, by a researcher at MGH, Sarah Lazar and colleagues, and they were looking at these kinds of age-related decays in brain functioning. And there's a group of, like, I think it was people 65 to 80, seeing if they had early onset Alzheimer's and other kinds of cognitive decrements associated with age. And so, yeah, I believe it's still an active research area, maybe not as active as it should be, but
Right.
yeah, people are definitely looking at it still.
Because Alzheimer's is, as everyone probably knows, the number of Alzheimer cases will be increasing in the future and becoming a major health problem for our country and probably the whole world. So
Yeah, no, it's
this looks
huge
this
implications.
type of research looks very promising.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And at least as far as I've seen, there's really aren't little to no downsides of being mindful or meditation. At least if they're out there, they haven't really been documented by research. So why not, right? What's the
Right.
harm? It's not like you have to take a pill. It has not nasty side effects, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. So that's a little bit about how being mindful, meditating can impact your well-being at work. We can also talk about performance, right? At the end of the day, if an organization is thinking about giving its people training in meditation or giving them space to meditate, I think most organizations are going to want to see some sort of benefit in terms of how their people function. There's been sort of allusions to that until recently, and we're finally starting to see some good evidence come out around that. So I put out a paper with some colleagues recently that looked at this, and several other papers have come out at the same time. We're starting to see more and more rigorous research. So just not to go into the weeds too much on this, but basically we looked at a whole bunch of groups of people in different contexts. Like we had some consultants and people who worked in a hospital and people who worked in property management and so on. And so what we found is actually that, we talked before about mindfulness is beneficial for self-control. So we actually found that really explained a lot of how they functioned at work. And it was all beneficial. So mindfulness, being more mindful, tended to help your self-control. And in turn, that tended to help how you performed your job, your task performance. It tended to help, the kind of citizenship you do around your organization. Like, would you help out other colleagues or, bring cookies and that kind of thing. And it also tended to reduce the amount of counterproductive behaviors you do. Like, could be little stuff like, being snippy with other people or stealing paper clips, or big stuff like, being violent towards colleagues or arson or like that kind of stuff. Yes, Tom, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I'm interested in the actual practice, because it seems that mindfulness doesn't necessarily require that you sit down. You could be walking, you could be running, you could be swimming, you could be folding laundry. And if water is not the limiting resource, you could be taking a shower. But I think that there's much to be said to incorporate mindfulness with ongoing activities, so that it doesn't seem like some strange thing, but rather a way of doing a familiar thing.
Very well said. I totally agree with you. And that to me gets to the essence of the third part of my talk, which maybe we'll have to shorten, unfortunately, just given time constraints. But how you engage in being mindful while you do activities, to me, that's the essence of mindfulness at work. And the extent to which people are able to do that, I think that really unlocks the benefits, all the stuff that we're seeing. And if you can't do that, then I think these benefits that we're talking about become less. And I still think there's much work to be done in terms of figuring out, both from a research angle, what does that mean? How do you measure that? And from a practice angle of how do you help people develop that capability? So great point. Thank you. So, I mean, if you want to skip ahead, we can kind of dive into that. So maybe I'll spend a minute more on these slides, and we can talk about that for a couple minutes if there's still a little time. So again, the performance, they've correlated being mindful, even helping people who are or helping nuclear power plant operators engage in greater safety behaviors, kind of stunningly. It's been correlated with helping doctors speak in a more favorable way with patients and get better customer service ratings. As I think somebody mentioned before, when you're sort of more attuned, maybe it was you, Juan, you're sort of more attuned, you're more there with people, you can kind of connect better with them. And I think that was demonstrated empirically with this study, where they actually looked at doctors sort of talking to patients. And they found with multiple measures, basically this pattern repeated itself, that the doctors who were more mindful tended to have better relationships and communication with patients. I'll just whiz through my study here. It might even be helpful for actually taking feedback and taking critique specifically. So I sort of gave students in a little lab study, we were sneaky, and we told them they were 28th percentile, which didn't fly too well. They felt bad about themselves, and they also tended to lose some self-control, kind of like we talked before. But what we found is actually those who'd been meditating beforehand, actually these effects were pretty weak. Whereas for those who were in a control condition, they actually felt really bad about getting really bad feedback. So we're still working on getting it published, but the idea here is that if you're more mindful, you can sort of be receptive to people telling you you're not so great, or at least you did a job poorly, and then hopefully that can help you learn as you sort of try to improve over time. Last thing I'll just hit on here, mindfulness has even been related to helping people lead better. If you're more attuned to others, sensitive to their needs, they get more inspired, they work harder, they're less inclined to do naughty things and undermine how the office works. They tend to not get burned out. So again, there's like tons of studies, we can't go into it all, but I just think the benefits are so broad and so consistent. It makes sense to me that any organization or virtually any organization would want to help cultivate mindfulness among their employees for all these reasons and many more. So to Tom's point, great, mindfulness, awesome. But like, what does that mean in the context of work while we're doing stuff, whether it's folding laundry or negotiating a contract or doing a surgery or whatever? Well, first off, how do you actually manage mindfulness at work? I still think this is very much an evolving body of practice, but some things people do, you can just do a little meditation. It doesn't have to be special. You can be standing, you can be running, you can be running from meeting to meeting. Like I remember talking to a doctor he was an oncologist, and he'd go meet a patient in one room, and then he'd go to the next room and meet the next patient. And he might be telling one patient that they're going to be fine, and the next patient that they have terminal cancer. And he'd say, like, look, I just check in for 3 seconds, when I'm touching that door handle about to move it, I just tune in, and my experience, I'm like, okay, I feel that, then okay, I go in, right? I meet the next person. There's a lot of apps that are great out these days. Headspace, 10% Happier, many more. It's very easy to get them on your phone. You can kind of just have self-guided meditations. There's more involved in-person training programs. A couple of the more popular ones are Search Inside Yourself and mindfulness-based stress reduction. But there's hundreds, if not thousands. And I think it's important to think, meditation is kind of it's the right word, a spectrum. Like you can go and sit on a mountaintop for hours on your cushion, and that in silence by yourself, and that's fine. Or you can do those little 3 seconds of handle meditation as you're about to go talk to somebody. So we talk about that as formal and informal practice respectively. I still think there's a lot of work to do to figure out how do you find the right balance here. Last thing I'll say before I get into the sort of the challenges of integration is, this is something that stands out to me is, man, mindfulness does a lot of cool stuff. For example, like we ran this study and we're giving mindfulness training. It reduced stress and burnout in some leaders that we studied. It also helped increase their psychological detachment, i.e. their ability to sort of get away from work when they're outside of work and feel and recover. It also increased their engagement. So, you get all these benefits and they're all good. And it's just one intervention, it's one quality. And as far as we know, there's little, if no downsides. So to me, it's a really efficient intervention. If you're in a workplace and you're trying to figure out how do we spend our training budget, how do we spend our time, like, man, there's just a lot of good that comes from this in very broad ways. And so few, if any, negative implications. Why not? So I think it's really powerful in that sense. And I don't think you can say that about every intervention you might do. But okay, so that's the good, that's the positive. But to your point, Tom, well, how do you actually engage in doing while being mindful? And I think it's certainly possible. But when you actually look at the descriptions of how we usually engage in tasks, how we usually think about doing a task and our understanding of mindfulness, mindfulness, these are almost like oil and water. They're really different, right? At least superficially. There's not a simple integration here. So we actually, my colleague and I published a paper in 2017 where we actually looked at this. It's titled Being While Doing. And the idea is that when you're really mindful, you're in this mode of being. You're just experiencing what's here right now, kind of like we did in that little exercise at the beginning. So you're accepting your experience, you're present, you're not really striving towards a goal, you're being relatively intentional and conscious. But then, as we all know, when you're doing tasks, like even something simple like tying your shoes, right? You just go into automatic pilot. You just kind of tie it up. You're sort of thinking about what else you're going to do. You're evaluating, did I tie my shoe correctly? So how you bring these two aspects of our mind together in the context of work, I think, is anything but clear. So we actually went out and talked to a bunch of people, about 40 people in a variety of different occupations who had an interest in mindfulness, and asked them about this. Said, like, how do you experience this? How do you bring these two together? On the surface, they don't look like they should fit. So that's, I just got a couple of slides to talk about their experience if we have time. The first thing they said is that this doing mode, right, our task-oriented mode of getting stuff done, which pretty much everyone thinks is the basis of work, becomes a problem when it volunteers for a task that it cannot do. So you can imagine, right, going back to our little properties list here, right, if we're naturally evaluating, like Keith, you mentioned you were kind of evaluating whether you're breathing correctly before, right? Like we do this very automatically. So that's not always the right way to engage with people, right? You might be, if someone makes a mistake, you don't necessarily want to engage and be very critical of them right away. Like, you might need to tell them they did something wrong, but you also need to sort of support them. So, if we're always stuck in this doing mode, trying to get stuff done, it can be really problematic. And the catch is that as we talk to people, everybody told us, hey, sometimes I just get stuck in my doing mode. I'm focused on the task. I can't stop thinking about yesterday, or I'm anxious about tomorrow. So people get stuck in this mode and they start thinking and thinking and thinking this way. So as one person described it, like this guy was recalling an incident that had happened to him the other day. The guy was very rude. I was upset about that all day. I was ruminating. I just couldn't leave it. So you're just like, I think we've all had those experiences where we just spin something over and over in our heads. And frankly, these moments are when you're not really being mindful. You're sort of pissed and judging this person and remembering something that happened the other day. You're not being present and accepting. So people reported sometimes they're actually able to transition, and they were sort of able to have these incidents and really engage from that mindfulness place, that being mode. So this guy gave another quote that talked to that experience. He said, my boss called me really angry with a list of things to do. Instead of immediately my brain going into, I don't want to do that, it was kicking into, yeah, just taking it in. What mindfulness tells me is accept what's coming in. So you can see here, this person might have a little bit of that evaluation or reactivity, but then they also have this experience of mindfulness, of just accepting and being present with the person. So what we took away from this is that it's at least possible, at least what people report, is they can kind of have the sort of usual sense of doing, right? Whether it's washing dishes or breathing or tying your shoes or writing a memo, they can kind of have all the thoughts that go along with that sort of operating. But they also have this new mode when they become mindful, operating sort of in tandem or alongside that. There's a sense of that being present, accepting, experiencing what's happening. And this is where we sort of come up with this idea that being mindful at work is an experience of being while doing, essentially. Like a guy gave an example. He was a manager and his subordinate screwed up. And so he talked about actually blending these two different modes together with some sense of evaluation and some sense of acceptance. So the subordinate had made a bad mistake. And so he did evaluate and say, yeah, this guy did screw up. But then he also accepted the guy and had this orientation because he was accepting him. He's like, I'm going to help him. I'm going to try to fix it. We're going to work through it. So to me, having both of these modes active at the same time actually acts as increases your cognitive resources for appropriately dealing with a situation. And so the last piece I'll close with here is, what they really described is there was a sense of continuity of mindfulness. This sort of gets to your point, Tom. Somebody talked about doing dishes and they said, well, being mindful. And they said, I'm really focused. I'm washing each sud and I really enjoy it. And my mindfulness is way up. I'm so in the moment. I'm not thinking about anything but what I'm doing. Right. So in this case, to me, like, I don't know how often people are able to inhabit this in a regular workplace, but they were able to find a way to sort of engage their tasks while also experiencing them and being mindful as they did it. So to me, this is kind of the gold standard, and it really speaks to what you were saying, Tom. And I think to me, this is sort of an open question to me for how you actually get people to do it. Yeah, I see your hand.
Yeah, I'm also wondering about the disruptors, because there's something about mindfulness and sociality that seem to be opposite poles. If you're called into conversation, if you're being coordinated as a part of a team, you're not in a position to pull yourself into a focus on the awareness of yourself. It's a notion of split focus. Some tasks accept that, but I think once something becomes communicative, once something spoken language, or maybe even sign language, I don't know, but something about engaging others, it is a pull in a different direction.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly a pull away from yourself. But to your point, I'm not sure, as long as you're being present and attentive in the moment, I'm not sure that's the problem. Like if you were just looking at someone else, I don't know that that's necessarily going to make you unmindful. But I think what happens at work a lot of times is you're not just paying attention to somebody else. It's your boss telling you, yelling at you for not doing something right, or saying, oh, we have this big problem that's coming up, I need you to fix it, right? So a lot of our interactions actually tend to orient us towards the past or future for one reason or another, or ask us to evaluate as something good or bad, right? You're hiring somebody, you have to decide which resume do you like the most. Well, I totally agree with you that the social context is very often problematic. I think if you had a group of people who are interested in being mindful, it could actually be supportive too. And so I really do think it depends on the context. But again, you can see why there's a lot of complexity around the issue. It's not totally straightforward. Yeah, Keith.
Is there an association between mindfulness exercises and blood oxygen levels? And if so, has anyone done the experiment of injecting oxygen into the workplace? I mean, I've heard that they used to do that in shopping centers.
They do that in casinos, Keith.
Oh, casinos,
Really?
okay.
Yeah.
Would does the oxygen make you kind of loopy and not make good judgments, or what? It's interesting. I've never heard of this.
It makes you focused on pulling the one-arm bandit over and over and over, really in the present.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that'd be a maladaptive presence there. Never heard of that. There's lots of research looking at oxygen levels in the brain, like a lot of that fMRI research I was showing you hinges on blood oxygen levels. But yeah, actually, like looking at blood oxygen in general across the body, that I don't know of any research, but I wouldn't be shocked if someone's done it. There's so much.
Yeah.
Well, because the opposite is true. They know there've been studies with the effect on the workplace of higher carbon dioxide levels.
Oh, interesting.
In terms of productivity and alertness.
Wow. Fascinating. I haven't seen that. Cool. So that's all I have in terms of topics to present. But obviously it's a very rich topic. Thanks for paying attention, and I'm happy to just keep discussing questions, or if you have more thoughts, happy to keep it going.
Well, I think that, yeah. Lester, I think, has another hand. Tom has another. Go ahead. Go
Yeah,
ahead, folks.
I have a quick question for you, Chris. Have you ever heard of another academic professor whose specialty is mindfulness, named Mark Muse? Meusse. Is that someone familiar to you? Okay.
No, I haven't heard of him.
Oh, I took a course by him through the teaching company. And I think I learned quite a lot from him. It was, I think it was 24 lectures on mindfulness. So I was wondering whether he was familiar to you. That's my question.
No, never heard of him, but I'll have to look out for him.
I think he's in Kentucky.
Okay.
Or Texas, one of those two places he teaches.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Keith? Oh,
You have a question, Keith? You're on mute.
No, I didn't have a question.
Okay, you had your hand raised, that's why.
Oh, I guess I forgot to lower the hand. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Any other questions for Chris? If not, then on behalf of the MIT Club Rhode Island, thank you so much, Dr. Lyddy. It is such an important topic. It's such a fascinating subject, basically, and I'm sure there are so many studies, including your work on understanding the mindfulness of not just work but in life in general, and trying to understand the well-being of the mind and of the body and our inner peace. So thank you so much. I look forward to reading some of your articles. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much for engaging. Great questions and discussion. And it was a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Everyone have a good evening. Take care.